Welcome to the video companion for episode 67 of the Classic Horrors Club podcast. This video contains highlights, video clips, and bonus features from the full podcast, which you can find on SoundCloud at the link shown below. Now sit back, relax, and join us as we celebrate the life and career of Lon Chaney beyond the Hunchback and the Phantom. Richard, I am inside the Paris Opera House. You can see the show behind me. I'm watching a wonderful ballet. This is the home of the legendary Phantom of the Opera as portrayed by Lon Chaney. And you, sir, apparently are out in the lobby. What's going on out there?
Well, actually, this is the Opera House, in the lobby part of it. So you're kind of just seeing the front end.
I'm right on the other side of you.
Seeing the other side of it. This is a beautiful theater. I don't know that we were probably not dressed appropriately for the opera.
Well, these days,
this is true. In 2022, we're lucky we have shirts on. Of course, Phantom of the Opera, one of the all-time classic films of the silent era and of horror films in general.
Yeah, one of probably I'll say it, better known Lon Chaney films, that and Hunchback of Notre Dame. But in our episode today, while we're going to feature the entire life and career of Lon Chaney, we're going to focus on 3 movies that maybe aren't as well known. Would you like to say what they are?
Yes, we're going to be covering He Who Gets Slapped from 1924, which is really a very good psychological thriller. Maybe not so much horror, but a film that doesn't get talked about as much, but should, because it is amazing. The Monster from 1925. A film that struggles a little bit with what it wants to be, but there is definitely some good stuff in that movie. And then, of course, The Unknown from 1927, also one of Lon Chaney's best known films, starring a very young and beautiful Joan Crawford. That movie is intense as well. We've got some intense films, a great opportunity to see 3 Lon Chaney films. Hunchback is great. Phantom of the Opera is great, but Lon did so many wonderful films and so many films that don't even qualify as horror movies. And so we're going to be talking about those and really going into these 3 films in depth as we take a look at mostly the film career of Lon Chaney. His private life was very private. And so we don't have any salacious tales like Lionel Atwill's to share with you. We're just talking about a wonderful actor and all of his great contributions to the cinema.
We have various sources of information that we've done for research. I want to share the ones that I'm using. I'm going to include quite a few images from this book, Lon Chaney Speaks. It's by Pat Dorian. It's a graphic novel about the life of Lon Chaney with he's a cartoonist for the New Yorker. And so the images evoke some of those cartoons. Excellent book. We have permission to use some images from that. And then I know it's not completely factual, but I did rewatch the Man of a Thousand Faces movie with James Cagney.
I pulled my information from a variety of sources, but a lot came from a great documentary called Lon Chaney, A Thousand Faces, which was put together by Turner Classic Movies in 2000.
We encourage everybody to listen to the full podcast on SoundCloud or wherever fine podcasts are heard. I want to circle back to the movie Man of a Thousand Faces. I never did really get it into the podcast. I just want to say that on its own, it is an entertaining movie, but it is highly dramatized on things that may or may not have been true. It presents a compelling family drama. In some ways, I actually viewed it as an origin story for Lon Chaney Jr. because so much about it is him growing up in his relationship with his father. So I do recommend that movie just as far as a movie for entertainment, not as a resource for facts about Lon Chaney.
There's so much great work that of Lon Chaney's that still exists. Sadly, so many of his films don't exist. In fact, I didn't give this fact on the podcast. I neglected to. He made 157 films between 1913 and 1930, and 102 of them are lost. Even when you look at those numbers, you're saying, well, yeah, but there's 52 films. Yeah, but there's 102 that are lost. And not all of those 52 are complete, and not all of them are available. And not all the ones that are complete and available are in good condition. They have a lot of decomposition, and the prints are poor. They're fuzzy. As I say on the podcast, Lon Chaney, his films, many of them are in desperate need of restoration and good scores put to them. So,
all right. Well, I'm eager. Let's get into it, shall we?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think we can agree on his birth date. I haven't seen any discrepancies in that. April 1st, 1883 in Colorado Springs. That match what you found?
That matches what I found.
And then almost immediately here come the discrepancies because I think it's known his parents were deaf mutes.
Well, we should mention he was born Leonidas Frank Chaney. That's actually his birth name.
And what discrepancy I immediately got was what kind of a burden that put on him as a child. The movie plays it up, he comes home with a black eye because the kids, and granted it's a different time, but still it's kind of hard to swallow that having parents that were deaf mute would be such a big thing that people would consider you an outcast.
I'm sure kids can be cruel. I'm sure he did probably have to put up with some.
Well, we do actually have a quote from Lon Chaney about this, and it's within another quote from one of the articles that I mentioned. If you don't mind, I'll just read this real quick. Among the questions inevitably raised is that his unhappy childhood, quote, during which he left school in his 4th year to care for his mother, who was crippled with rheumatism. To those who believed he had an unhappy childhood, he said, "It isn't true that I had an unpleasant childhood. I was a pretty good football player and played a fair game of baseball. I had a lot of friends too. For some reason, people want to sympathize with me, having gotten the idea that I was an unhappy kid. That's the bunk. I don't think my childhood is really unhappy, for youth has boundless optimism and an infinite capacity for achieving happiness under any and all circumstances."
Despite the fact that he came in what some people would say at a disadvantage, having both parents deaf, I think that it actually helped him. It's helped him become skilled in pantomime, because in order to communicate with his parents, he couldn't speak, right? So he had to be able to do it differently. So by the time he enters a stage career in 1902, he took that skill that he had as a child and moved it into the stage career and was very successful, as he worked his way up. Is that in 1905, he married 16-year-old Cleva Creighton. They had met prior to that, obviously, and it was I got the gist that it was a relatively short courting period. They got married. I mean, a year later, Creighton Chaney was born in 1906, and of course, Creighton Chaney, better known to us now as Lon Chaney Jr. Unfortunately, the marriage was not a long-lived one, and it was not very successful. Cleva was clearly dealing with what we would now identify as some mental health issues. Well, she goes across the street. I guess they were living across the street. She goes to a theater where I believe they both were working. She was a singer, and Lon was working on whatever production that they were working with. And she attempted suicide by swallowing mercuric chloride. She did not die, but it ruined her throat and it ended her singing career. Unfortunately, the scandal because of this, Lon, whether he felt it or whether it was, legitimately looked negatively upon him, he had to leave stage work. And by this point, they were living in California, and the Hollywood film industry, was still in its infancy, but was beginning to thrive. And so he was able to make that transition from stage to acting in films. This is when Lon begins his film career. He makes his film debut in 1913 in a short subject called Poor Jake's Demise. Between 1913 and 1917, he made a total of 77 short subjects. His oldest existing film is a 1914 short called The Tragedy of Whispering Creek. So in those early films, he was a supporting player. He was a contract player for Universal Studios. He was becoming successful. He was making a name for himself. At what point he goes to studio exec William Sistrom, asks for a raise, and William Sistrom said, you're just average. You're basically a nobody. You'll never be worth more than $100 a week. And I'm fairly certain he lived to regret those words. By 1915, Lon begins making feature films. 1915 is when Lon married Hazel Hastings, his second wife. He had met her during his stage career. Between 1915 and 1930, he makes a total of 80 feature films in 15 years. His oldest complete feature film is The Price of Silence from 1916. Really becomes a standout actor with a role in a 1918 film called Riddle Gone. The following year, 1919, is when he first began to incorporate his makeup skills, which again were all self-taught, in a movie called The Miracle Man. And then he followed this up with The Penalty in 1920, in which he plays an amputee. That movie in particular, I mean, what he did to his body to give the impression that he was, an amputee is mind-boggling. He would essentially tie his legs behind, like below the knee, basically behind his legs in a special harness. And he could only wear it, I think, for like 10 minutes at a time. It was incredibly painful. It's indicative of what he did throughout his career with makeup work. He put himself through a tremendous amount of pain, but he did it because of his love for the craft and his makeup skills. I mean, clearly, he was the first real special effects makeup artist in Hollywood. By this point, we're in the early 20s. Some of his popular roles at the time, he plays the role of Fagin in Oliver Twist in 1922. Another movie he did called Shadows in 1922, politically incorrect by today's terminology, but he plays an Asian character. Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1923, of course, his work as Quasimodo is legendary. This brings us to 1924, and time to talk officially about our first film, He Who Gets Slapped.
He Who Gets Slapped was directed by an old friend of ours, Richard, Victor Sostrom. He had directed The Phantom Carriage, which we've talked about, and I believe both loved, at least I know I did. He also wrote it with Carrie Wilson. It was based on a play by Leonid Andreev. Pretty sure I botched that. Leonid Andreev.
Andreev.
Yeah, Andreev, thank you, sorry. And it starred Lon Chaney. oddly. Norma
Oddly enough.
Shearer, John Gilbert, Ruth King, Mark McDermott, Ford Sterling, and Tully Marshall. It runs 95 minutes, and it was released on December 22nd, 1924. Richard, what did you think of He Who Gets Slapped?
I loved it.
Yeah, I did too. It's very artsy. I credit that to the director, similar to Phantom Carriage. Here, the recurring imagery seems to be, the clowns spinning this ball, and sometimes that sort of morphs into the globe. So Lon Chaney plays Paul Beaumont. He's a scientist. He's working on some theories about the origin of life, and the man basically that's funding his experiments steals them and claims them to be his own, makes a big presentation, says that Paul Beaumont is just his assistant, didn't have anything really to do with it, and slaps him in front of everybody, which makes everybody laugh, because that's really, really funny. And that's a recurring thing I want to talk about as we go through this, is how funny people seem to think that is, that somebody gets slapped. On top of that, his wife is sort of in cahoots with this benefactor and basically leaves Paul to go with him, leaving him, destroyed. He runs off and joins the circus as a clown, and his big act is getting slapped by the other clowns.
Paul was happy, right? I mean, he had kind of like he had this trauma, he had kind of buried it, he was okay, and then Consuelo enters the picture, and then he's in love, and then that's where the love triangle starts, because of course Pisano falls in love, and then to add fun to the whole mix of Paul's existence is when the Baron attends a show, and I mean, you see Paul kind of snaps, and he wants to go after, but then the other clowns are thinking it's just all part of the shtick and stuff, whatever. And then that's where he begins to want to gain revenge on the Baron. And then of course the Baron is now being introduced to Consuelo by her father, Count Mancini, and the Count is wanting almost to sell his daughter to the Baron, and then that's really where you've got all these triangles going on here, and then Paul clearly, his heart is for Consuelo, but her heart's for somebody else, and he's got that measure of revenge. And that's where the psychological thriller part of it really kind of comes into play, and then everything falls apart very rapidly, and he begins to unravel.
Here's the scene I really like. So Consuelo can tell literally that he is sad, and he asks, why is he so sad? And she tells him, well, if you were in love, you wouldn't be. Well, of course, ironically, he is in love, and he hasn't told her. He does take that minute to confess to her that he does love her. She laughs and thinks he's joking and slaps him, just like he gets slapped during the show. And so, there's layers in meaning there that I don't even think I can comprehend, but it's I don't know. It's so well done, so well put together, so much there.
1925. Next up is our next film, Chaney often gets thought of as like this, he's like this legitimate horror film star, when really you look at it, the number of true horror films that Lon Chaney did actually were far outweighed by movies in which he just played characters that were in makeup, but not necessarily a horror character, maybe dark, maybe twisted, but not in a true horror film sense. The Monster, which is the next movie we're going to talk about, is one of those that I think truly does fit into the horror film category for the most part. But it's a movie that struggles with trying to identify what it wants to be, depending on what point in the film you're watching it.
So The Monster, it was directed by Roland West, and I have a feeling you're going to have a story there to tell when we get to it. It was also written by West, Willard Mack, and Albert Kenyon. It's based on another stage play. This name I think I will be able to pronounce a little better than the other one, Crane Wilbur. I think I did that all right.
I think you did well.
Yeah, besides Lon Chaney, it has Gertrude Olmsted and Hallam Cooley. Runs 86 minutes and was released on March 16th, 1925.
This movie is almost like two films. It's almost like you've got a short subject going on, that's the bookends, and then you've got a horror movie in the middle. And quite honestly, the two different elements don't sync up very well, in my opinion. The two different styles don't blend, and ultimately hurt the film from being as good as it could be.
Oh, I agree 100%. And that's interesting because I'm iffy on horror comedies to start with. They don't often work well for me. Usually it's the comedy elements I don't even like to start with. The odd thing about this is I really like the two separate things. I mean, I think this is a good comedy. I laughed and I enjoyed it on its own, but together, no. And
we're 30 minutes into the movie before we get to see Lon Chaney. His appearance in the film,
and he's not really in it that much.
No, I mean, he really is more of a supporting character in some ways, top billed, and certainly when he's on screen, the focus is on him. I mean, he's clearly the lead. His debut entrance is amazing. Not the most challenging role for Chaney, not the most memorable, but what he had to work with, he did incredibly well. And I think that's what kind of elevates the movie. I think if it wasn't Chaney in that lead role, if it was just Joe Average, the movie probably would be one of those silent films that would be kind of lost in the shuffle a little bit. But
I was very disappointed that that's all he had to do in this movie. But yet, I remember our main character. I remember Johnny Goodlittle and his correspondence course to become a detective and him getting his kit. And that was charming and delightful and fun. And
yeah, it was.
That's what I took from the movie. I can barely remember anything of the old dark house part of it. What was next for Chaney? What happened in the next couple of years before our last movie?
By 1925, of course, he is under contract to MGM, so he is doing some big films. One of the biggest, of course, is The Unholy Three in 1925. This is the silent version. He did the sound version of this as well. He did a movie, another movie in 1925 called The Tower of Lies. That is a lost film. He did The Blackbird in 1926. He did The Road to Mandalay. Tell It to the Marines, 1926. No makeup work in this one. He plays basically a drill sergeant, but he was made an honorary Marine. That's how impressive or how impressed the Marines were. Mr. Wu, which he did in 1927.
The Unknown was directed by Todd Browning. So that is one of the 8 or 10 movies that they worked on together, he and Lon Chaney, written by Valdemar Young. Besides Chaney, it starred Norman Carey, Joan Crawford, little known actress that wouldn't really do much with herself, and Nick DeRuis. It runs 63 minutes, at least in a particular version. I hope you'll tell us more about the missing footage from that, and was originally released on June 24th, 1927. What do you think of The Unknown, Rich?
I do really enjoy this movie. Lon Chaney is really good as Alonzo, the armless man. Of course, as we discover early in the film, he does have arms. There's a reason why he's essentially hiding the fact that he has arms, because he has 2 thumbs and he has, committed some crimes, and so now he's basically hiding out, and so he hides his arms.
So for some reason, Nanan, Joan Crawford, cannot stand the touch of a man, and I'm not really sure why. It seems like an extreme reaction to have. I don't know if she, or maybe you caught something obviously happened in the past, and she cannot stand the touch of a man. So when she sort of could possibly have a thing with Malabar, what was he? I'm getting confused because there's a lot of similarities between this and He Who Laughed. Was he a strong man?
I think he was the strong man, okay. Yeah, because there's one scene where he's doing the bar around his head.
Yeah, he can't keep his hands off her, and that just turns her off. She won't entertain. And so to think that she's met an armless man, that's her perfect man.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So
it is. Yeah, it's kind of bizarre. I mean,
yeah, but then to think, okay, I'm really going to cut my arms off. That's extreme.
That's the dark and twisted side of it. Malabar, right? I mean, he's fallen in love with her, and so once he realizes kind of what her phobia is, he works around that, and he's like, I'm gonna make you love me, but I'm not going to do it by force. I'm going to show you what kind of good person that I am. And he basically goes about wooing her and courting her. And that's what wins her over, right? Is that she begins to realize, wow, you really aren't like the other men in her life, whatever caused her this trauma. And she gets past her trauma and begins to accept Malabar for who he is and falls in love with him. And the whole reason that they're being able to fall in love with each other is because Alonzo has left. to go have his arms removed. He removes himself from the romantic triangle and basically allows the two of them to fall in love. And at that point, that's when he begins to kind of snap and realize, okay, unlike we're in He Who Gets Slapped, he kind of snaps, but decides to shift that focus on the Baron and the Count. And here Alonzo decides, well, I'm going to shift the focus on Malabar, and decides to, in a brutal way, cause Malabar to lose both of his arms, because Malabar has come up with his act, a strongman act, where he has basically both arms are tied to horses on treadmills. And his whole thing is that by sheer strength, he's going to hold both of these horses at bay, which in itself is a stupid idea, but that, of course, is the doorway that Alonzo has opened for him. And so he's like, well, I've got the perfect thing right here. And they won't even know that I did it. And I think that's when you get to that segment. If this movie was done today, it would be horrifically graphic. There would probably be an entirely different outcome. But back then, I think it was just the idea that that's where this was headed. Very intense for 1927. Proof positive that you can tell a story, you can tell it in a compelling way, you can get the audience on the edge of their seats, and you don't need to always be horrifically graphic. You can, if you're a good filmmaker, a good storyteller, if you're a good actor or actress, you can project this sheer horror without showing blood and guts and body parts being flailed every which way.
Joan Crawford once said she learned more about acting from watching Lon Chaney work than from anyone else in her career. Quote, "It was then I became aware for the first time of the difference between standing in front of a camera and acting," unquote. And then I found another little piece of that where she elaborates a little further or says it in a different way. "He was the most intense and exciting individual I had ever met, a man mesmerized into his parts. When he worked, it was as if God were working. He had such an intense concentration. His complete absorption filled me and my coworkers with such awe that we never even considered addressing him with the usual pleasantries until he became aware of and addressed us."
So he did a few other films in 1927, Mockery, London After Midnight, of course, that is the notorious lost film. Every once in a while, a rumor pops up, hey, it's resurfaced in this archive. I think there's a very good chance that this movie exists in a private collection somewhere and that we just don't know it. So the next film that Lon Chaney does is The Big City in 1928. This is a lost film. He also does Laugh, Clown, Laugh that year. While the City Sleeps, also released 1928, which I believe was kind of a film, almost like a film noir-ish crime drama. West of Zanzibar from 1928, and then Thunder from 1929 is kind of infamous because during the filming of Thunder, this is where Lon Chaney developed pneumonia. And because of snow, some scenes with snow in that, fake snow gets lodged in his throat. It kind of becomes infected, adds to the whole issue that he's got breathing problems. And then a short time after that, he gets diagnosed with lung cancer. I don't know if there's any correlation between the two, but one does kind of follow the other. Sadly, Thunder is a mostly missing film. Only half a reel of the film exists. But it is his last silent film. The next film he does would have been his first official sound film, and when it was his first official sound film, a remake of The Unholy Three.
Professor Echo.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Now, folks, if you'll just gather around a little closer now. Come right in a little closer. That's it. That's fine. That's fine, folks. Now, then, if you'll be real quiet, I'll see if I can get the little boy to say something. Well, how are you today, Tommy?
Oh, I'm feeling fine, thank you.
Well, that's fine. Now, what are you going to sing for the folks today?
She was a butterfly's daughter.
Oh, he's going to sing She Was a Butterfly's Daughter.
He dies of a throat hemorrhage on August 26, 1930, at the age of 47. The U.S. Marine Corps provided a chaplain and an honor guard to play taps. That he is interred in an unmarked crypt next to his father.
Lon Chaney, where you been so long? Sit right down and let me sing you a song. I seen you on a movie in my room. Oh, Lon Chaney with the velvet touch, silver dagger in the black man's crutch. Now's the time